We are in the company of General Lord Richard Dannatt, former head of the British Army. So we're talking about all sorts of defence-related issues. Now, I did ask you before the show, before this hour started, if you'd seen or if you'd listened to the podcast, The War Game, which I've been mesmerised by over the past few days. For those of you who don't know, it's a 5-podcast series. It's produced by Sky News and Tortoise, and it tries to imagine a Russian attack on the United Kingdom and how it would be reacted to by the British government. They've got the former Defence Secretary Ben Wallace playing the Prime Minister, Amber Rudd as the Home Secretary, Jack Straw as the Foreign Secretary, General Sir Richard Barons is playing a big role too. They've got lots of military people involved, and it is incredibly frightening because effectively it demonstrates, assuming that all of their figures are accurate, which I'm sure they are, it shows how much our defences have been depleted over the last, ever since the end of the Cold War, really. And this is something that I know you've got a track record of speaking out on. So I said to you before, you must listen to this podcast series.
Well, indeed. I mean, I've heard, I haven't listened to the whole thing. I've heard good reports of it. And it is, as you say, really quite frightening. But I'm afraid it's only the logical explanation, if you like, of what has been happening really since the end of the Cold War, where successive governments have taken successive peace dividends and have run down our armed forces to a really very alarming degree. And where are we now? The one good thing that Donald Trump has done since he came back to the White House was make it quite plain to European countries that we have to take a greater responsibility for European security. And because the Americans are focusing much more on the Indo-Pacific, and that's not an unreasonable thing for them to do. But it has been a real wake-up call for this country and for other European countries to realise that just 2% of GDP being spent on defence, which was the NATO norm until quite recently, is totally inadequate. And now the argument has gone in this country from 2% to 2.3 to 2.5. In Rachel Reeves' last statement, she went to 2.6, 2.7 sort of, and then the Prime Minister said 3%, 3.5%, and Donald Trump came in and said it's got to be 5%. Well, that's fine. It's good to hear that being said. But after that backbench rebellion in the Commons last week, with the changes to the national economy as a result of the binning of their welfare cuts, you just wonder where this money is coming from. It's fine to talk about it, but they've got to find it, because we've got to spend more on our own defence and do it quickly.
But you listen to The War Game, and you, at the end of it, you think, 5% won't be enough, 10% won't be enough. And the problem is, as you well know, you announce increased defence spending, but it's not as if you can turn on a tap and all the equipment suddenly appears. It can be years.
You're right, but the other 5 figures that are interesting and very alarming. In 1935, we were spending less than 3% of GDP on defence, and we failed to either appease or deter Hitler. In 1939, when the war broke out, that shot up to 19%, and in 1940, when we were fighting for our very survival, it became 46%. That's the terrible cost of fighting a war. How much better to decide what you need to spend to deter war in the first place?
But that ship has sailed, hasn't it?
That ship has sailed to an extent, but I mean, where do you start? And now is a good time to start. And this government has got to get serious. It's got to start placing contracts with defence industry. Defence industry has got to fire itself up. Where it hasn't got production lines, it's got to start them. And there is no more time to be lost, or otherwise the outcome of that 5-series podcast that you alluded to will become a reality.
Some people listening will be saying, here's Iain Dale again, sort of making out that the Russians are a real threat to us. Of course they're not. How seriously do you take the Russian threat, particularly to this country? Because something, I can't remember whether it was in that podcast or not, but I was listening to something the other day where they said that had there been a war in the 1980s, it wouldn't have been Germany that Russia would have gone to, that they would have attacked us because they saw us as the American aircraft carrier, effectively.
There's a strong element of that, and indeed we were the American aircraft carrier. Just as in the Second World War, we were the launch pad for Operation Overlord and the invasion of Europe from 1944 onwards. Of course, had the Warsaw Pact attacked during the decades of the Cold War. That battle would have started off in Germany, and Germany itself would have suffered a tremendous amount of destruction. But at that stage, the NATO armies were really quite strong. And by the late 1980s, we had begun to change the way we would have fought the Russians, and actually we would have been more effective than actually at the time we realised. But now where we are today, I think, yes, there is the threat of an attack on this country, but I think a much more likely scenario is if we see a ceasefire in Ukraine in the not too distant future. I think within 12, 18, 24 months of that, when the Russians have reconstituted their armed forces, and let's face it, their economy is on a war footing at the present moment, sharply unlike ours. The most likely scenario I would see is Putin testing NATO itself, testing it by making an attack perhaps on one of the Baltic countries, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, not because he particularly wants to capture those countries, but he wants to test Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. Article 5, an attack on one member state is an attack on all. And if he attacks Latvia, is Washington going to fight for Latvia? And once that question is asked and not answered resoundingly successfully, then frankly the cohesion of the West, the cohesion of NATO starts to crumble away. And I think that is Putin's ultimate strategic goal.
Well, that's the theory of the Tunbridge Wells MP, a Liberal Democrat who used to be in the British Army, where he thinks it'll be Estonia because Britain has over 1,000 soldiers in Estonia. So he thinks that would be the trigger because Keir Starmer would then want to invoke Article 5. Well, of course, the Estonians would as well. Keir Starmer would ring up Donald Trump, and Donald Trump would say, Estonia, where's that? And that would be the end of NATO.
That's exactly my point. Yeah. That's exactly my point. And Mike Martin is absolutely right to make that point. In a sense, you could say that the British battle group in Estonia is a hostage waiting to be taken prisoner, if you like. Yeah. But having said that, it's important that countries like ours and other countries have got forward deployments because this is all about showing the solidarity of NATO. And if that scenario that Mike Martin talks about and that I talk about should come about, that Putin pushes against one of those countries, it's really important that NATO does stand shoulder to shoulder. Otherwise, the security of the West is very much compromised.
In terms of where we spend this extra money that it hopefully is going to be allocated to defence, things change, don't they? Because when you first joined the army, it was still very much presumably infantry-based. That technology has moved us on immeasurably. We now have sort of cyber defences which need to be invested in. And you mentioned drone technology earlier, which, as you said, the Ukraine war has shown how valuable that can be. Where are we in this country on developing our own drone technology?
We've made a lot of progress, but we need to make an awful lot more. The history of warfare has always been the history of invention and counter-invention. And when you are in a conflict situation, that cycle of invention and counter-intervention goes even more quickly, which is why if you look at what's happened over the last 3.5 years in Ukraine, the cycle that I'm just talking about has been extraordinarily rapid. Now, right from the start, drones were being deployed because we all knew that drones were part of warfare of the future. But just in what's happened in Ukraine, initially, drones were being controlled by GPS navigation, so jammers were deployed forward. The Russians have got around that by using very fine fibre optic cable, which is a direct link between the operator and the drone itself. The battlefield is now a labyrinth, if you like, of fibre optic cables all over the battlefield. And it's actually quite scary in many ways that it becomes a very personal battle between a drone operator and an infantry soldier trying to advance towards his next position. It becomes extremely personal. So tactics have had to evolve, have had to change. Now, we know that, we're studying it, but the big question is are we investing quickly enough in our own drones, our reconnaissance drones, our attack drones, our defence drones? My fear is that we're not. And until the government starts to commit serious money beyond the existing defence budget, well, frankly, you can't do more if you haven't got the cash. Industry will not produce what we need unless contracts are are signed, production lines are increased, and.
Richard Dannatt's book is called Korea, War Without End. It's out now.